the problem is, I think, if you go into diplomatic negotiations thinking they are like business deals, and if you just push hard enough, or if you use your usual tactics, then you will succeed. Then you will discover, as Trump is now discovering, that it's quite a bit harder than that. That's why we have diplomats who spend their entire lives training for this sort of thing.
Look, it's that time of the week now where we take a look at big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories. And Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, joins me now. Elisabeth, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for being with us. Let's talk about Russia, Elisabeth. President Trump said at the end of last week that peace in Ukraine, that nothing would happen until Putin and he got together. Later today, he is due to call Vladimir Putin, and then President Trump will call President Zelensky. Do you think we might finally see something happen beginning this week?
Well, President Trump has clearly put a lot of faith into this phone call. In a sense, he has raised the pressure on himself to succeed by not giving enough power to the talks that took place in Turkey last week. So that was going to be proper peace negotiations, was the idea. In the end, as we know, among top leaders, only President Zelensky turned up. President Putin didn't turn up. And President Trump wasn't there either. That puts a lot of pressure on Trump to succeed in this phone call with Putin today. But Putin has signaled that he is not exactly in a peaceful kind of mind, because he did Russia did launch a significant attack on Ukraine just in recent hours.
Yeah, I mean, there was a very significant. I think I read it was the biggest, one of the biggest drone attacks to date that they launched on Ukraine. Do you think President Trump's position on this whole conflict is evolving as he begins to realise it's not as simple to end as he thought it was, and indeed as he begins to realise that maybe Russia isn't as interested in ending it as he'd hoped they would be?
Well, so the problem is, I think, if you go into diplomatic negotiations thinking they are like business deals, and if you just push hard enough, or if you use your usual tactics, then you will succeed. Then you will discover, as Trump is now discovering, that it's quite a bit harder than that. That's why we have diplomats who spend their entire lives training for this sort of thing. Now, there is a case to be made, as he has done, for the top dogs, as it were, talking amongst themselves. But Putin has been in power for a very long time. He has incredible expertise in dealing with foreign leaders, and I think Trump is discovering that Putin is quite a bit wilier and less straightforward than Trump assumed. So he is in a bit of an underdog position vis-a-vis Putin, who has seen off quite a few Western leaders during his quarter century in power.
Yeah, well, look, Vladimir Putin has also long insisted that any ceasefire deal would have to address what Russia claims to be the causes of the conflict, which he says are the alleged the persecution of pro-Russian communities within Ukraine, fascist sympathies within the Ukrainian government, some of them whom he even calls Nazis, and NATO expansion. If these are what his demands are, given that some may think, certainly in the West, that these demands, even these complaints, even themselves, don't really correlate that closely with reality, what can he possibly be given that satisfies them?
This is exactly the point, and it has been the point ever since he invaded Ukraine. I think we all remember that Russia made the case that Ukraine was a fascist or neo-Nazi country and with an illegitimate regime. Well, how can Ukraine prove that? It's none of that. They can say, the Ukrainian leadership can say, we are not that, but the Russians will continue saying, no, this is what you are like. This is why we have to invade. So, and then it can keep adding ridiculous allegations regarding Ukraine, and so as Ukraine, and indeed as Ukraine's allies and partners, what can the Western world do to satisfy Putin, especially since he is likely to add more potential infractions that he feels Russia has suffered along the way. So this is where we are today. What can Russia be given? Well, I think what Trump is likely to be prepared to concede to Russia are some of the territories Russia is currently holding, and of course Ukraine, which Russia annexed over a decade ago. Now that would be a very significant concession, and let's hope that Trump has cleared anything he is willing to concede to Russia with Ukraine before making such proposals.
Yeah, let's hope indeed. Look, finally, Elisabeth, before I let you go, Keir Starmer's agreeing a deal with the EU today, and part of that is going to include closer cooperation on defence. Britain's going to have some access to the 150 billion euro EU rearmament fund. How important is it for the defence of Europe that the UK and EU defence becomes more aligned?
It is extremely important. And then one can say, well, 150 billion euros is that's not a massive amount, but nevertheless, the link has now been established. And we should remember that one of the challenges here in Europe is that arms manufacturing is quite diverse. It's done in different countries by different companies, and by the way, companies that also transport their various components between among different countries. So it is a bit scattered, and anything that can be done to make it less scattered is to be saluted, because we have, on the other hand, the U.S. manufacturing industry, which is very united. It's not split up. Inevitably, it's not split up among as many countries as the European defense industry is. So anything that can bring that defense industry closer together is to be saluted, and that is it has always been the case, but especially now that we have to ramp up production very quickly.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Good to speak to you as always.
Mayor Putin, how do you think you can get those talks on track?
We have to meet. He and I will meet. I think we'll solve it, or maybe not, but at least we'll know. And if we don't solve it, it'll be very interesting.
And then did Austin Tice come up when you talked?
They're not in good shape, as you know.
Wir sind uns einig darüber, dass die russische Seite eine gute Gelegenheit gehabt hätte, in dieser Woche erste Gespräche über ein Friedensabkommen mit einem vorangegangenen Waffenstillstandsabkommen zu führen. Wir sind sehr enttäuscht, dass dies nicht stattgefunden hat. Es lag der Ball ausschließlich bei Russland. Es waren alle Bedingungen erfüllt, um ein gutes erstes Gespräch zu führen. Wir haben darüber auch gerade noch einmal mit Präsident Trump gesprochen. Wir informieren ihn laufend auch über den Fortgang der Gespräche auf unserer Seite. Wir haben mit Präsident Zelensky vereinbart, dass wir das fortsetzen und dass wir jetzt auch in den nächsten Tagen und Wochen immer wieder Angebote machen, um zu Gesprächen zu kommen. Es muss aber auch klar sein, wir stehen hier auf dieser Seite zusammen. Das ist die Europäische Union, das ist die Koalition der Willigen und wir sind fest entschlossen, der Ukraine weiter zu helfen, damit dieser schreckliche Krieg zu einem Ende kommt. Die diplomatischen Bemühungen, die wir bisher unternommen haben, sind leider an der mangelnden Bereitschaft Russlands gescheitert, jetzt erste Schritte in die richtige Richtung zu tun. Aber wir werden nicht aufgeben, wir machen weiter und wir werden uns gut auf der europäischen Seite zusammen mit den Amerikanern koordinieren.
Strona rosyjska nie wykazała dobrej woli. Strona rosyjska nie zamierzała bardzo trudnej.
Thank you. Sanctions will welcome President Macron.